The first impressions. The hum of the airport was a familiar tune to Ava Johnson. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, her natural curls framed her face like a crown of elegance. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her every step deliberate, exuding an aura that commanded respect without demanding it. In her hand, she held a leather laptop bag, and in the other, a first-class boarding pass. The world around her buzzed with the usual airport chaos, but Ava moved through it like a calm in the storm. As she approached the gate, a young attendant glanced at her ticket, his polite smile faltering for a brief moment before he recovered. "Right this way, Mom," he said, gesturing her toward the priority boarding line. Ava nodded, offering a warm but brief smile before proceeding. She had traveled too many times to count, and had long stopped noticing the occasional raised eyebrow or fleeting look of surprise when she presented herself as a first-class passenger. Once aboard, Ava made her way to her assigned seat. The plush leather seat in the first-class cabin awaited her, and she settled in with practiced ease. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, removed her notebook, and began jotting down ideas for her upcoming presentation. The flight to Washington, D.C. wasn't long, but it was pivotal. Her work as an equity strategist was not only her passion, but also a responsibility she carried with pride. Today's meeting was crucial. If successful, it could lead to a nationwide rollout of diversity initiatives in major corporations. Ava had no room for distractions. Her piece was short-lived. A flight attendant, Miranda Scott, strode down the aisle with a confidence born of years in the industry. Her uniform was pristine, her stride purposeful. But when her sharp eyes landed on Ava, a subtle shift occurred. Miranda's steps slowed, and her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. To an untrained eye, it might have gone unnoticed, but Ava didn't miss it. Miranda approached with a tone that was polite but laced with condescension. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her gaze fixed on Ava's boarding pass. "Can I see your ticket, please?" Ava looked up, her pen pausing mid-sentence. "Of course." She handed over the boarding pass with a calm smile. Miranda examined the ticket longer than necessary, her frown deepening. "This is for first class?" she asked, her voice betraying doubt. "Yes," Ava replied, her voice steady, unruffled. "Is there a problem?" Miranda hesitated before handing back the ticket, her lips pressed into a tight line. "No problem," she said curtly before turning away, but her stiff demeanor suggested otherwise. Ava's calm exterior didn't waver. She resumed her notes, choosing to focus on her work rather than the unsettling exchange. However, it didn't escape her notice that Miranda was now whispering to another flight attendant, casting furtive glances in her direction. Minutes later, Miranda returned, her posture rigid, her tone firmer. "Miss Johnson, could you step aside for a moment? There seems to be a mix-up with your seat." Ava's brow furrowed. "A mix-up? My ticket was confirmed. What seems to be the issue?" Miranda folded her arms. "I need to verify something. Please follow me." The other passengers in the cabin exchanged curious glances, their murmurs growing as Ava stood gracefully, her laptop bag in hand. She followed Miranda toward the galley. Despite the obvious tension, Ava's poise remained unshaken. "I'm going to have to move you to the main cabin," Miranda announced, folding her arms. "It appears there's been an error." Ava blinked, her calm demeanor finally giving way to a flicker of disbelief. "An error? My ticket is valid. I don't understand why I'm being asked to move." Miranda's voice dropped to a harsher whisper. "Look, I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security." For the first time, Ava's eyes narrowed. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "If that's your decision, I'll comply. But this isn't the last you'll hear about it." She returned to her seat, collected her belongings, and followed Miranda toward the economy section. The air was heavy with whispers as passengers in first class watched the scene unfold. Ava's steps remained measured, her head held high, but the grip on her laptop bag tightened ever so slightly. When she reached the cramped seat Miranda indicated, Ava placed her bag under the seat and settled in without a word. Miranda walked away briskly, the tension in her shoulders unmistakable. Meanwhile, Ava took out her phone and began typing a message, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. When she hit send, a faint smile tugged at her lips. Miranda, oblivious to the brewing storm, returned to the first-class cabin, her steps lighter, her expression smug. She felt vindicated, though she couldn't quite articulate why Ava's presence in first class had unsettled her. To her, the issue was resolved. But the calm that Ava exuded was not one of acceptance. It was the quiet before the storm. A quiet storm brews. Seated in the cramped economy section, Ava Johnson looked out the window, her composed exterior giving no hint of the storm brewing inside her mind. The city skyline below faded as the plane ascended into the clouds. Her seatmates, sensing her dignified presence, made no attempt at small talk. To them, she appeared calm, even unbothered. But beneath her measured demeanor, Ava's mind was a flurry of calculations. She tapped her phone screen, her fingers moving with precision. The message she had sent earlier was already in motion, and the response was swift. Ava, we've received your note. Can you confirm what happened? We're ready to act as directed. Ava glanced briefly at the screen before typing back, confirming. Details to follow after landing. Stand by for now. She tucked the phone into her bag and took a slow, steadying breath. The hum of the engines and the murmured conversations of other passengers faded into background noise as Ava mentally reviewed her options. This was more than a personal insult. It was a glaring example of systemic issues she had spent her career addressing. She would not let it pass. In the first-class cabin, Miranda Scott moved about with an air of forced confidence. She checked on passengers, offered drinks, and even managed a smile or two, but her mind kept wandering back to Ava. Something about the woman had unsettled her. It wasn't just her calm composure. It was the way Ava had looked at her, not with anger, but with an unnerving certainty, as if she already knew how this would end. Miranda leaned into the galley where her colleague Dennis, a senior flight attendant, was prepping the next round of service. Everything okay? Dennis asked without looking up. His voice carried the weight of years of experience, and there was a sharpness to it that Miranda couldn't ignore. I'm fine, Miranda replied curtly, but her tone betrayed her unease. Dennis glanced up, his brows furrowing. You've been off all day. Does this have to do with that passenger you moved? Miranda stiffened. It's nothing. Just a gut feeling. She didn't seem like she belonged in first class. Dennis's expression darkened, and he put down the coffee pot. A gut feeling. Miranda, you can't just act on instincts like that. Passengers pay good money for those seats, and unless there's a serious issue, you don't move them. What exactly did she do wrong? Miranda hesitated, fumbling for an answer that wouldn't sound flimsy under scrutiny. She didn't act like the other passengers. She seemed out of place. Dennis sighed, shaking his head. Out of place doesn't cut it. You're walking a fine line, Miranda. If she files a complaint, this could blow back on you and the airline. Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but a chime interrupted her. The intercom buzzed to life, and Captain Harris's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 35,000 feet, and everything is running smoothly. If there's anything you need, please let our crew know. We'll keep you updated on our progress. Thank you for flying with us. The routine announcement should have reassured Miranda, but instead, it only heightened her anxiety. She returned to her duties with a tense smile, all the while casting nervous glances toward the economy cabin. Back in economy, Ava was approached by Clara, a young and empathetic flight attendant who had noticed the earlier commotion. Clara crouched slightly to meet Ava's eye level, holding a small cup of water. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Clara asked softly, her tone laced with genuine concern. Ava looked up, her expression softening. "I'm fine, "Thank you," she replied, taking the water. "I appreciate your kindness." Clara hesitated, sensing there was more to the story. "If there's anything I can do, please let me know." Ava gave her a faint smile. "You've already done more than enough." Clara nodded, though the interaction left her unsettled. She couldn't shake the feeling that Ava's calm was masking something far deeper. As Clara moved away, Ava took another sip of water, her focus returning to her thoughts. 7 minutes had passed since Ava sent her first message. 7 minutes that Miranda Scott, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering around her, had spent believing the issue was resolved. In the galley, Dennis picked up the ringing in-flight phone. His usual composed demeanor shifted as he listened to the voice on the other end. After a brief exchange, he handed the phone to Miranda, his expression unreadable. "It's for you," he said quietly. "They're asking for you by name." Miranda's heart skipped a beat. She wiped her palms on her uniform before lifting the receiver. "This is Miranda," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding an incident on this flight. Miss Ava Johnson has contacted us, and we're monitoring the situation closely. Ensure she is treated respectfully for the remainder of the flight. A full report will be required upon landing." Miranda felt the blood drain from her face. She managed a stammered response before hanging up. Her hands trembled as she placed the receiver back on its cradle. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "What was that about?" "Nothing," Miranda muttered, her voice hollow. "Just a routine check." Dennis didn't press her further, but the tension in the galley was palpable. Ava sat back in her seat, her phone once again in her hand. She sent another message, this one even briefer than the last. "All set. Awaiting confirmation." The response came almost instantly. "Understood. We'll be ready on the ground." Ava placed her phone back in her bag, her expression unreadable. The clouds outside the window stretched endlessly, a serene backdrop to the subtle but seismic shifts occurring inside the plane. Ava knew the wheels she had set in motion couldn't be stopped now, and she didn't intend to stop them. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. For the next hour, the tension in the cabin grew like an invisible weight. Miranda avoided the economy section entirely, but every so often, she caught sight of Ava sitting calmly, her presence an unspoken reminder of Miranda's misstep. Passengers exchanged whispers, some piecing together fragments of the earlier drama. Clara, in her quiet way, offered Ava extra water and snacks, though Ava politely declined. The young attendant's kindness didn't go unnoticed, and Ava made a mental note to mention her in her report. As the flight neared its descent, Miranda's nerves were frayed. She returned to the galley, where Dennis was tidying up. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Dennis said, not unkindly. "Shut up, Dennis," Miranda snapped, though there was no venom in her voice. Dennis chuckled softly but said no more. He had seen enough in his years to know when someone was digging their own grave. Whatever was happening with Ava Johnson, Dennis knew Miranda was in for a reckoning. As the seatbelt sign lit up and the captain announced their approach, Ava leaned back, allowing herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had handled the situation with grace and strategy, and now the ball was rolling exactly as she intended. The tables turned. As the plane began its descent, the faint hum of engines was accompanied by a thick tension that had settled over the crew. Miranda Scott's polished veneer of confidence had all but shattered. She fumbled with her tasks, her hands trembling as she poured coffee for first-class passengers, spilling some onto the tray. She muttered an apology, her nerves fraying with each passing second. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, observed her quietly. His years in the industry had taught him to recognize when someone was in over their head. Miranda's stiff posture, darting eyes, and uncharacteristic clumsiness spoke volumes. Still, Dennis refrained from intervening. He had warned her earlier, and now she had to face the consequences. In the economy section, Ava Johnson sat with the poise of someone who knew she was in control. She glanced at her watch, noting the time. The messages she had sent earlier had set the wheels in motion, and the gears were turning just as she had anticipated. She reached into her bag, pulled out her notebook, and jotted down a few more observations. The faintest hint of a smile graced her lips. Calm, confident, and unshaken. In the cockpit, Captain Harris reviewed the updated flight report sent from the airline's executive office. He frowned as he read through the complaint, noting the name Ava Johnson. As a seasoned pilot, Harris knew when a passenger carried significant weight. The email he had received emphasized Johnson's importance, not just as a passenger, but as a key figure in the airline's upper management structure. He glanced at his co-pilot, who was busy monitoring their approach. "We've got a situation in first class," Harris muttered, his tone calm but serious. The co-pilot raised an eyebrow. "What kind of situation?" "Let's just say one of our flight attendants made a judgment call she shouldn't have. We'll need to address it as soon as we land." The co-pilot nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had been briefed on the importance of certain passengers before, but rarely had they encountered someone with direct ties to the board of directors. Back in the main cabin, Clara approached Ava again, her genuine concern evident in her soft smile. "Miss Johnson, would you like anything else before we land? Water? Coffee?" Ava looked up, her expression warm but measured. "I'm fine, Clara. Thank you for your kindness." Clara hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but a subtle shake of Ava's head told her not to press further. She nodded and moved on, though her mind lingered on the poised woman who had endured such blatant disrespect. The landing announcement came over the intercom, and the plane began its slow descent through the clouds. Ava closed her notebook and tucked it into her bag. She straightened her posture, her every movement deliberate. Passengers around her adjusted their belongings, but Ava remained still, her focus entirely on what would happen next. In the first-class cabin, Miranda could barely breathe. The phone call from the executive office replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She had no doubt the disciplinary process would be swift and unforgiving. Her colleagues noticed her unease but refrained from commenting. Even Dennis, who usually had a quip for every situation, remained silent. As the plane touched down with a smooth landing, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. The usual post-landing shuffle began, with passengers unbuckling seatbelts and reaching for their carry-ons. Ava remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her expression serene. Miranda, stationed at the front of the plane, forced a tight smile as passengers filed past her. Each thank you and goodbye felt like a dagger, but she maintained her composure. She avoided looking toward the economy section, but her thoughts were consumed by Ava Johnson. The way Ava had held herself, unflinching and composed, had unnerved Miranda in a way she couldn't explain. When most passengers had deboarded, Ava stood, gathering her belongings with the same quiet precision she had displayed throughout the flight. She walked down the aisle, her steps steady, her head held high. As she reached the front of the plane, her eyes met Miranda's. The flight attendant's forced smile faltered. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Johnson," Miranda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava paused, her gaze unwavering. "You're welcome," she replied, her tone calm, but with an edge that sent a chill down Miranda's spine. "I'm sure we'll be in touch." Without another word, Ava stepped off the plane, leaving Miranda frozen in place. Dennis, who had been watching from the galley, approached her with a shake of his head. "She's not just any passenger, is she?" Dennis asked, though he already knew the answer. Miranda said nothing, her face pale. She didn't need to answer. The weight of her mistake was already crushing her. In the terminal, Ava was greeted by a professional-looking man in a dark suit. He carried a sleek tablet and wore a badge identifying him as a representative of the airline's executive team. "Miss Johnson, I'm Michael Grant from the executive office," he said, extending his hand. "We've been briefed on the situation, and I want to personally apologize on behalf of the airline. We're taking this matter very seriously." Ava shook his hand, her expression neutral. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I trust the airline will handle this appropriately." "Absolutely," he assured her. "We've already initiated a review of the incident, and disciplinary action will follow. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to reach out." Ava nodded, her calm exterior unchanged. "I'll provide my full account to the board. I'm sure you'll hear from me soon." Michael nodded, his professionalism intact, but there was no mistaking the respect, and perhaps a hint of fear, in his eyes. Ava Johnson was not someone to be underestimated. In the employee exit area, Miranda sat in a small room, waiting for the disciplinary committee's decision. The sterile walls and harsh fluorescent lights only heightened her anxiety. The weight of what she had done, and what it would cost her, pressed down on her like an anchor. She had underestimated Ava Johnson, and now she was paying the price. Meanwhile, Ava's car glided through the city streets, the skyline of Washington, D.C., looming ahead. She leaned back in her seat, her phone in hand. A message from the airline's CEO flashed on her screen. "We are deeply sorry for the incident and are taking immediate steps to address it. Your insights will be invaluable in shaping our future training programs. Please let us know when you're available to discuss further." Ava typed a brief response. "I'll schedule time this week. Let's ensure this never happens again." As the car pulled up to her destination, Ava stepped out gracefully, her heels clicking against the pavement. She had turned a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for systemic change. The fight wasn't over, but Ava Johnson was prepared to see it through. The aftermath begins. The next morning, the airline's disciplinary board convened in a stark, glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. The sun streamed through the windows, casting sharp, unrelenting light on the table where Miranda Scott sat, flanked by two of the airline's legal representatives. Across from her were members of the executive committee, their faces stern and unyielding. A projector displayed a detailed timeline of the events on Flight 473, with Ava Johnson's name prominently highlighted. Miranda's palms were sweaty, her confidence eroded to the point of fragility. The airline's HR director, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Lane, led the meeting. Margaret was known for her fairness, but she was also uncompromising when it came to upholding the airline's reputation. "Ms. Scott," Margaret began, her voice calm but sharp. "Let's start from the beginning. Can you walk us through your decision to move Miss Johnson from first class?" Miranda hesitated, her throat dry. I thought there was an error," she stammered. "She didn't seem." "Seen what?" Margaret interrupted, her tone edged with impatience. "Let me remind you that perception alone is not a justification for reassigning a passenger seat. Miss Johnson's ticket was valid, confirmed, and paid for in full. What was your specific reasoning?" Miranda fumbled for words, but none came. She had built her decision on assumptions she could no longer defend. "It was a gut feeling," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "A gut feeling," Margaret repeated, her face unreadable. "Do you understand the implications of your actions, not only for Miss Johnson, but for the airline as a whole?" Miranda nodded weakly. I didn't mean for it to escalate." Margaret leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Intent doesn't absolve you, Miss Scott. Miss Johnson is not only a valued passenger but also a significant shareholder in this airline. She has a well-documented history of advocating for equity and inclusion, both within our company and beyond. Your actions have undermined our efforts and damaged our reputation." Miranda's stomach churned. She had known Ava Johnson was influential, but hearing the extent of her power drove the reality home with crushing clarity. Meanwhile, in Ava's office, Ava sat in her sleek office, a corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling city below. Her assistant, Maya, had just finished briefing her on the airline's immediate response to the incident. "They implemented temporary measures," Maya said, placing a printed memo on Ava's desk. mandatory sensitivity training for all cabin crew, a review of first-class protocols, and a formal apology drafted by the CEO. Ava skimmed the document, her expression unreadable. "It's a start," she said, her tone even. "But it's not enough." Maya hesitated. "What else do you want to see?" Ava leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "I want accountability. Not just for me, but for every passenger who's been treated unfairly. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger issue." Maya nodded, admiration evident in her gaze. "Understood. I'll prepare a list of additional recommendations for the board." "Good," Ava replied. She glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a message from the CEO. "Can we arrange a call today to discuss your expectations?" She typed back quickly. "Available at 3 p.m. Let's ensure the conversation leads to real change." The disciplinary hearing. Back in the conference room, Miranda's ordeal continued. Margaret's questions were relentless, each one peeling back another layer of Miranda's flawed judgment. "Do you understand why Miss Johnson's composure during this incident is significant?" Margaret asked, her tone pointed. I suppose it showed she was calm under pressure," Miranda replied hesitantly. "It showed restraint, Miss Scott," Margaret corrected. "She had every right to escalate the situation on the spot, but she didn't. Instead, she allowed the airline's internal processes to take their course. Her actions demonstrated professionalism that far exceeded your own." Miranda lowered her eyes, shame washing over her. She could feel the weight of the committee's judgment bearing down on her like an anchor. "We will review the full account of this incident," Margaret continued. "But based on what we've heard so far, it's clear there are serious consequences to your actions. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending further review. Additional disciplinary measures will be communicated following the conclusion of our investigation." Miranda's heart sank. She wanted to protest, to plead her case, but the words felt hollow even in her mind. She knew she had no defense strong enough to undo the damage. Elsewhere, a press conference unfolds. Unbeknownst to Miranda, the story of the incident had already begun to spread. A few passengers who had witnessed the event had taken to social media, describing Ava's dignified response and the inappropriate behavior of the flight attendant. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the airline was trending for all the wrong reasons. To mitigate the fallout, the CEO held a press conference, addressing the incident directly. "We are deeply regretful for the treatment Miss Johnson experienced on our flight," he stated, standing behind a polished podium with the airline's logo displayed prominently. "This is not reflective of our values as a company. We are taking immediate steps to ensure incidents like this do not happen again, including mandatory training for all employees and a comprehensive review of our policies." Journalists peppered him with questions, but he maintained his composure, emphasizing the airline's commitment to accountability. Behind the scenes, his team was working furiously to manage the backlash, but they knew the real work lay in convincing Ava Johnson that their response would be more than performative. Ava takes the call. At 3 p.m. sharp, Ava dialed into the CEO's private line. The call began with formalities and apologies, but Ava cut through the niceties with her usual precision. "Let's talk about next steps," she said. "What assurances can you give me that this incident will lead to meaningful change?" The CEO outlined their plans, from updated training modules to more rigorous oversight of crew behavior. Ava listened carefully, interjecting only to ask pointed questions. "Good intentions won't fix this," she said. "I want measurable outcomes. Increased diversity in leadership, transparent reporting on discrimination complaints, and a commitment to improving the passenger experience across the board." The CEO agreed, acknowledging her concerns. "We value your partnership, Miss Johnson, and we're committed to making this right." Ava ended the call with a sense of cautious optimism. Words were a start, but she would ensure they translated into action. Miranda's reflection. Later that evening, Miranda sat alone in her apartment, the silence oppressive. She replayed the events of the past 2 days in her mind, each misstep and assumption haunting her. For the first time, she allowed herself to confront the deeper issue, her biases. She had judged Ava Johnson not on her actions or demeanor, but on an unspoken prejudice she hadn't even realized she carried. The realization was humbling, but it also ignited a spark of determination. Miranda knew she had a long road ahead if she wanted to rebuild her career and her character. But first, she had to acknowledge her mistakes fully and take responsibility for the harm she had caused. A reckoning and a path forward. The days following the incident unfolded like dominoes, one after the other, creating ripples of accountability and self-reflection that extended far beyond the airline's walls. At the airline headquarters, Ava Johnson walked into the airline's corporate headquarters wearing the same calm authority that had unnerved Miranda days earlier. Her tailored suit spoke of confidence, her composed expression of resolve. She was ushered into a spacious conference room where the airline's CEO, several board members, and senior executives waited. The tension in the room was palpable. "Miss Johnson," the CEO began, standing to greet her, "we cannot express how sorry we are for what occurred on Flight 473. Ava shook his hand but remained silent, her gaze sweeping the room. She gestured to the seat across from the CEO, making it clear she intended to set the tone for the meeting. The CEO resumed his seat, clearing his throat. "We've implemented the measures we discussed, but we want to hear from you directly. What more can we do to regain your trust and ensure no passenger ever experiences this again?" Ava leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "Trust is earned through action, not words," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The measures you've taken are a start, but they're not enough. This isn't just about sensitivity training. It's about dismantling systemic biases that allow incidents like this to occur in the first place." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I want to see tangible changes, starting with more diverse hiring practices, real consequences for discriminatory behavior, and transparent reporting mechanisms that hold everyone accountable, from flight attendants to executives." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from solemn to thoughtful. One of them, an older man who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Miss Johnson, your insights are invaluable. Would you consider working with us as a consultant to implement these changes?" Ava's gaze sharpened. "I'll consider it under one condition. This can't be a surface-level initiative. I want full authority to assess your operations and make recommendations, and I expect those recommendations to be implemented, not shelved." The CEO nodded. "Done." Ava sat back, her expression unreadable, but a small nod of satisfaction indicated she was ready to move forward. This wasn't about revenge. It was about paving the way for a better future. Miranda's turning point. While Ava was shaping systemic change, Miranda Scott was at her lowest. Suspended from her duties and facing a formal investigation, she had been forced to confront not just her actions, but the biases that had fueled them. For days, she avoided her colleagues and ignored the calls of well-meaning friends. Shame weighed heavily on her, and she struggled to see a way out. On the fifth day, a knock at her door interrupted her spiral of self-pity. Reluctantly, Miranda opened it to find Dennis standing there, holding a small paper bag. "I figured you hadn't been eating properly," Dennis said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He set the bag on the counter and turned to face her, his expression a mix of concern and disappointment. "I don't need a lecture," Miranda said defensively. "I'm not here to lecture," Dennis replied, crossing his arms. "I'm here to remind you that this doesn't have to be the end." Miranda's eyes narrowed. "It feels like it is." Dennis sighed. "You messed up. Big time. But what matters now is what you do next. Are you going to wallow in guilt, or are you going to take responsibility and do the work to fix yourself?" Miranda looked away, her chest tightening. "I don't know where to start." "Start by listening," Dennis said. "To others, to people like Ava Johnson who've had to deal with this kind of treatment their whole lives. And then do the hard work of unlearning the things that led you here." His words struck a chord, and for the first time, Miranda felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know if she could rebuild her career, but she resolved to start by rebuilding herself. Ava's broader vision. As the weeks passed, Ava's influence began to take root. The airline announced a partnership with Ava's consulting firm, pledging to overhaul its internal practices. Press releases detailed plans for comprehensive diversity and inclusion training, anonymous reporting systems, and a new leadership mentorship program aimed at underrepresented groups. The changes didn't come without resistance. Some employees grumbled about the new policies, but Ava anticipated this. She organized town hall meetings, inviting staff to share their concerns, while also educating them on the importance of equity and inclusion. At one such meeting, Clara, the empathetic flight attendant who had shown kindness to Ava, spoke up. "I just want to thank Miss Johnson for bringing this issue to light," she said. "As someone who's seen passengers treated unfairly before, I'm glad to see changes being made." Ava nodded, her expression warm. "Thank you, Clara. It's people like you who remind me that change is possible, even in the most challenging environments." Miranda's path to redemption. Miranda took Dennis's advice to heart. She began attending workshops on implicit bias and sought out literature on equity and inclusion. She also reached out to a local community organization, volunteering her time to learn from people whose experiences differed from her own. One day, she mustered the courage to write a letter to Ava. In it, she expressed her regret, not just for what had happened on the flight, but for the unexamined biases that had led her to act as she did. She didn't expect a response, but writing the letter felt like a step toward healing. To her surprise, Ava replied a week later. The email was brief but encouraging. "Miranda, thank you for your letter. Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path. Change is hard, but it's necessary for all of us. Best, Ava Johnson." Miranda read the email twice, tears stinging her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness she sought, but the knowledge that Ava had recognized her efforts gave her the motivation to keep going. The ripple effect. Months later, the airline was unrecognizable in the best way possible. Employee morale improved, passenger complaints decreased, and the company's reputation began to recover. Ava's initiatives had transformed the airline into a model for others in the industry, and her name became synonymous with change. Miranda, reinstated after completing her suspension and additional training, returned to work a different person. She no longer moved through her job with blind authority. Instead, she approached each interaction with humility and a genuine desire to serve. Her colleagues noticed the change, and slowly, respect replaced the judgment they had initially harbored. One day, Miranda and Ava crossed paths at an industry event. Miranda approached Ava cautiously, her hands clasped nervously. "Miss Johnson," Miranda began, her voice steady but soft. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Ava regarded her for a moment before offering a small smile. "Keep doing the work, Miranda. That's thanks enough." Miranda nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she felt like she could move forward. A legacy of change. 1 year later, the airline's headquarters buzzed with activity as employees prepared for a major event. The unveiling of the company's new equity and inclusion program, designed by Ava Johnson herself. The air was charged with anticipation, and a palpable sense of progress hung over the gathering. Among the attendees were employees of all levels, industry leaders, and media representatives, eager to witness the results of a transformative year. Ava stood backstage, reviewing her notes. She had spent the past year working tirelessly to turn a painful personal experience into a catalyst for change, not just for the airline, but for the entire industry. Her consulting firm had grown exponentially, attracting clients who admired her sharp mind and unwavering commitment to justice. Today wasn't just about the airline. It was about proving that real, systemic change was possible. Maya, her assistant, appeared by her side. "You're on in 5, she said with a smile. Ready? Ava smiled back, her calm confidence as steady as ever. Always. The presentation. When Ava stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Her presence commanded attention, not through force, but through an undeniable aura of leadership. Behind her, a large screen displayed the program's title, Equity Beyond Policy, a new standard for the skies. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice steady but warm. "Today is a milestone, not just for this airline, but for everyone who believes in the power of accountability and growth." She paused, scanning the room. "A year ago, I sat on one of your planes as a passenger. What should have been a routine flight turned into a moment of humiliation, rooted in assumptions and bias. But instead of letting that moment define me, I chose to use it as an opportunity to challenge the norms, to ask the hard questions, and to demand better." The audience listened intently as Ava outlined the changes implemented over the past year. Mandatory bias training, anonymous reporting systems, a diverse hiring initiative, and the introduction of employee resource groups to ensure ongoing dialogue. She shared stories from employees who had benefited from these changes, including Clara, who had been promoted to a leadership role in recognition of her outstanding empathy and professionalism. "True equity isn't about checking a box," Ava concluded. "It's about creating a culture where everyone, regardless of their background, appearance, or status, feels valued and respected. And that begins with accountability." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted long after Ava left the stage. Miranda's new chapter. Meanwhile, Miranda Scott stood at the back of the room, watching Ava with a mix of awe and gratitude. Her journey over the past year had been one of intense self-reflection and hard-earned growth. She had taken Dennis's advice to heart, immersing herself in workshops and volunteering for initiatives that challenged her assumptions. Slowly, she rebuilt her reputation, earning the trust of her colleagues and eventually the airline. As part of her disciplinary process, Miranda had been required to meet with Ava to discuss the incident. What she expected to be a confrontation turned out to be a lesson in grace and accountability. "I'm not here to vilify you," Ava had said during their meeting, "but I hope this experience has taught you the importance of questioning your assumptions." Miranda had nodded, her voice heavy with emotion. "It has, and I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for everyone I serve." That conversation had marked a turning point for Miranda. Today, she was back in uniform, serving as a flight attendant once again, but her approach to the job had changed entirely. She took pride in her role, ensuring that every passenger felt seen and valued. She had even become a mentor for younger crew members, sharing her hard-earned lessons to help them avoid her mistakes. Ava and Miranda's paths cross again. After the event, Miranda approached Ava with cautious steps. She waited until the crowd had thinned before speaking. "Miss Johnson," she said softly, her hands clasped nervously. "I don't know if you remember me." Ava turned, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Of course, I remember you." Miranda's cheeks flushed, but she pushed forward. "I just wanted to thank you. Not just for what you've done for the airline, but for giving me the chance to grow. I spent the past year learning, reflecting, and trying to become the kind of person who wouldn't make the same mistake again." Ava studied her for a moment before nodding. "Growth is never easy, Miranda, but the fact that you've committed to it says a lot about your character." Miranda exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "That means more than I can say." Ava extended her hand, and Miranda shook it, the gesture feeling symbolic of a new chapter for both of them. The ripple effect. The impact of Ava's work extended far beyond the airline. Other companies took notice, seeking her expertise to address their own systemic issues. Her firm launched initiatives that tackled inequity across industries, from healthcare to technology, and her influence grew steadily. She became a sought-after speaker, her talks inspiring audiences to embrace accountability and pursue meaningful change. The airline, now a model for equity and inclusion, saw a resurgence in its reputation. Customer satisfaction ratings soared, and employees reported feeling more valued and engaged. Clara, now head of cabin services, led by example, ensuring that empathy and professionalism remained at the forefront of the airline's culture. Ava's legacy. One evening, Ava sat in her office, overlooking the city skyline. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maya. "We just signed our 50th corporate client. Congratulations, Ava. You're changing the world." Ava smiled, setting the phone down. She thought back to that flight, the moment when she had been humiliated and underestimated. What had started as a painful incident had become the foundation of her life's work, a testament to the power of resilience, strategy, and grace. Her assistant knocked on the door, peeking inside. "You've got a meeting in 10, but I thought you might want to see this first." Maya handed her a framed letter, Miranda's handwritten apology from a year ago. Ava read the final line, her smile softening. "I may never fully make amends for my actions, but I promise to carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life." Ava placed the frame on her desk, its presence a reminder that change wasn't just about policies or programs, it was about people. And every person, given the chance, could choose to grow. A resolution and a new beginning. Later that evening, Ava sat in her office, the city lights twinkling like a sea of stars outside her window. The weight of the day's events settled over her, not as a burden, but as a quiet, fulfilling exhaustion. Her work was far from done, but the progress she had seen gave her hope. People were changing, systems were evolving, and voices that had been silenced were finally being heard. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from her mother. "So proud of you, Ava. Your father would be too. Let me know when you're free for dinner this week. Love you." Ava smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. Her parents had always instilled in her the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. That lesson had carried her through every challenge, including this one. A final flight. Several weeks later, Ava found herself boarding a flight. Not as an advocate, not as a consultant, but simply as a passenger. This time, there was no apprehension, no lingering discomfort. The airline had implemented its changes swiftly, and Ava felt a sense of pride knowing she had been part of that transformation. She settled into her first-class seat, greeted warmly by Clara, who now carried herself with the assuredness of a seasoned leader. "Welcome aboard, Miss Johnson," Clara said with a genuine smile. "It's an honor to have you with us today." "Thank you, Clara," Ava replied, her voice equally warm. "You've done incredible work." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly, but she accepted the compliment with grace. "It's because of you we had the opportunity." As the plane ascended, Ava leaned back, allowing herself a moment of reflection. The events of the past year played in her mind, a vivid montage of challenges, breakthroughs, and growth, not just for her but for everyone involved. Miranda's letter. During the flight, a member of the cabin crew approached Ava with a sealed envelope. "This was left for you by one of our team members," the attendant explained. Ava accepted the envelope, her curiosity piqued. Inside was a handwritten letter from Miranda Scott. It read, "Dear Miss Johnson, I wanted to thank you again for your patience and grace during what must have been an incredibly difficult experience. Over the past year, I've done my best to confront my own biases and make amends, not just to you, but to everyone I've wronged through my assumptions and actions. I've learned that growth is not a destination but a journey, and I'm committed to staying on that path. Your strength inspired me to reflect on who I was and who I wanted to be. I hope one day I'll have the privilege of making a positive impact as you have. Until then, I'll continue doing the work, one step at a time. Thank you for not giving up on people like me. Sincerely, Miranda Scott." Ava read the letter twice, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. She folded it carefully and placed it in her bag, a reminder of the power of accountability and forgiveness. A legacy that lasts. By the time Ava's flight landed, she had already drafted an idea in her mind, a new initiative that would go beyond the airline industry. She envisioned a program that would train individuals and organizations worldwide to recognize and address systemic biases, creating lasting change in every field. When Ava returned to her office, she called Maya in to discuss her idea. "Let's start with a pilot program," Ava said, her tone energized. "We'll partner with industries that have the most work to do. This isn't just about the skies. It's about creating equity everywhere." Maya grinned. "You're unstoppable. You know that." Ava smiled back. "Not unstoppable, just determined." Epilogue. A world changed. The following years saw Ava's vision expand into a global movement. Her consulting firm became a leading voice in the fight for equity, influencing industries ranging from healthcare to technology. Governments sought her expertise, corporations adopted her frameworks, and communities around the world began to see tangible improvements. At the same time, Ava maintained her humility, always crediting the people who inspired her along the way, like Clara, who became a prominent advocate for passenger rights, and even Miranda, who used her own experiences to mentor others about the dangers of unchecked assumptions. On the anniversary of the fateful flight that had set everything in motion, Ava received a message from Miranda. "1 year later, and I'm still learning. Thank you for being my turning point." Ava replied simply, "Keep going. The world needs more people willing to grow." Final reflection. As Ava stood at the window of her office, watching the world move below, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. What began as an insult had become an opportunity. What could have been a moment of defeat had become a catalyst for change. Ava Johnson wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a leader, a builder, and a legacy in motion. And though her work would never truly be finished, she was content knowing she had set the foundation for a better world, one where dignity and respect were no longer privileges but rights for all.